I was recently given this piece of common advice on making videos, that you should already have a title and thumbnail figured out before writing a script. It allows you to focus on a singular point, so you only polish up anything that contributes and eliminate anything that could muddy it. But as anyone who's ever gone into video making can attest to, plans can change, and what you initially conceptualize can shift dramatically by the end product. Although that runs counter to this advice, I've found better ideas can spring from a more chaotic process. Video production isn't a straightforward affair, but instead a squiggly line, and if you're willing to embrace that, it ultimately makes the final video, and you as a video maker, better as a result. I've enjoyed using Twitter threads to explain the interesting stories and challenges behind some commissioned thumbnails, in turn teaching people about cool techniques or software that they can employ themselves. And I'd like to do the same in this video about a recent squiggly line journey. This is the story about how and why I produced a 90-minute video about the creation and legacy of 2005's Resident Evil 4. And it's a journey that began all the way back in April of 2021 as a video investigating the metaverse. This seems like a shift in content for a channel that mostly covers video games, but the metaverse very much owes its existence to current gaming trends. One of the first videos I made on this channel back in 2017 was initial impressions on Epic's Fortnite Battle Royale, which had been quickly implemented into the base game to cash in on a popular trend. But what I couldn't have expected right in that video was that Fortnite would go on to become a genuine phenomenon, averaging almost 15 million users a day, and has since evolved into something more than just a Battle Royale game. Its one-off Travis Scott concert and the introduction of a no combat mode in May of 2020 were first steps into that arena, stripping out the conflict and instead letting players hang out and do some fun activities. A digital mall for the modern age, accessible from your phone, PC or games console. In April of 2021, it had been announced that Epic had scooped up $1 billion in funding to help with its long-term vision for an expanded Fortnite metaverse. Think Ready Player One, but with the default dance. Of course, Epic weren't the only people interested in the metaverse, and as if history were repeating itself, a long-term tech rival had been involved in the concept from an earlier date. One quote that has stuck with me from this initial research came from an August 2019 episode of the Joe Rogan Experience with former id Software programmer, FPS innovator, and then Oculus Chief Tech Officer John Carmack. To quote, "The promise of VR is to make the world as you want it. It's just not possible on Earth to give everybody all they'd want. Not everyone can have Richard Branson's private island because there's just not enough islands in the world. But even on a more mundane level, not everyone can have a mansion or even necessarily have a home theatre room. And these are things that we can simulate to some degree in virtual reality. We can have VR devices cheap enough that lots of people will be able to have these, and we can make better software and it can be a better world in many ways." This quote summed up the insidious undercurrent of the metaverse concept. Not only is this fantasy world a distraction from issues within our own, it essentially puts power within the hands of a few select platform holders. In the metaverse, you'll pay digital rent and utility bills to Epic or Facebook in order to live on a private island that looks to some degree like one in the real world, depending on your hardware specifications. This was the motivation behind wanting to write the video, to disagree with what felt like an oncoming and inevitable future, and in turn get people up to speed on metaverse arguments. But the problem with this initial idea was that it didn't really have a good point, or at least I never figured one out. Part of the problem was I never quite understood what the metaverse pitch was. And it was also very easy when writing to go off on interesting tangents. For example, did you know that Epic has been able to leverage part of their metaverse funding to develop a technology called the Volume? This is an all-digital soundstage that leverages the Unreal Engine to project real-time environments onto enormous LED panels. It solves the problem of traditional green screen because it gives actors something to act off of. Initially used in streaming productions like Star Wars' The Mandalorian, the volume has since gone on to be used in major films like The Batman and Spielberg's The Fabelmans. It's a very cool technology, but one like the metaverse with an insidious undercurrent to it. The elimination of physical sets leads to the elimination of unionized film workers, as instead these jobs can be done by unprotected VFX teams already driven to razor-thin margins. To note, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, a recent film heavily criticised for its lackluster look, was filmed on the volume. The VFX industry has long been the unsung hero of modern productions, but every year talent is being destroyed by a race-to-the-bottom approach. It's something that I'm unfortunately familiar with. Despite graduating with a degree in computer graphics, I was eventually forced out of a dream job in the VFX industry when I learned that below minimum wage wouldn't cover the cost of living in the most expensive city in the UK. Wait, what was I talking about again? Going back to that initial piece of advice, I needed to find a means to focus that idea. I came up with a title and a thumbnail a month later, which was the concept of wanting out of this metaverse future. However, even with these starting points, it felt as if the video was missing a solid hook. Around this time, Facebook announced an exclusive title for their Quest 2 headset, a port of 2005's Resident Evil 4, set to release in October that year. RE4 is a ubiquitous title, and Facebook's intent was that its familiarity would be a smooth onboarding to the streams of VR, and eventually, the metaverse. Although Half-Life Alyx had come out the previous year and had been designed with similar intent, PC headsets are still specialist devices whose cost and hardware requirements cut out a huge potential of players. Whereas the Quest 2 was priced like an entry-level tablet, and didn't require a separate machine to work. Like RE4 became the hook for buying a Quest 2, it also became the hook of the video. I could talk about why the game was being ported, which would let me talk about its designs and what elements could be translated successfully, and use that to segue into how I was a Trojan horse for the metaverse. Of course, to properly talk about it, I would have to invest in a Quest 2, and as I'd have to save money to do so, I'd work in the meantime on more immediate videos alongside a full-time job. Not just so I didn't go stir crazy, but also because I wanted to make good to my Patreon subscribers. By the way, did you know that there is a hot side of Patreon? Because according to my metrics, you probably didn't. I've had one active since 2019, and mostly use it as a tip jar for anyone who'd like to support the channel on a monthly basis. That money goes directly into the production of videos like this, covering the cost of licensing production software, buying the games I cover, and even affording me some mental relief from my other jobs. In fact, if every one of my subscribers chipped in at the lowest tier of £1 a month, I could do this full time, and be able to do projects people have loved like Quest and Show and Bullet Time more often. For those who can afford it, there's also a tier at £4 a month that makes you an exclusive hot cider producer. You'll have additional sway over what I produce, and I'll also put your full name in every video. Some of my producers have been with the channel for several years, and their names include Arcadeology, Eric Hamilton Schneider, Gameplayer 1500, Mouse, Valerie B, and lastly, the MVP of the Hot Cider project, VG. Of course, if you can't afford to do this monthly or even at all, one of the biggest ways of supporting the channel is sharing my content with others, especially on websites like Reddit and Twitter. Recommending my work to larger creators also eventually gets it in front of an audience who might not know I exist. Either way, anything is appreciated, and in return, my line is always open if you would like to pitch any ideas. Like, say, a video about RE4 VR. In November of 2021, I leveraged Black Friday sales to buy a Quest 2 and Resident Evil 4 VR. Finally, I had the chance to try out hardware that my colleagues in essay writing had been evangelizing as the future of video games. I was fully on board for RE4 to be the Super Mario 64 of virtual reality games, and for computing to never be the same again. I fucking hated it. It should have been obvious to Mark Zuckerberg that perhaps making a horror game your flagship VR experience was a really bad idea. Getting overwhelmed by hordes of human-looking enemies and eliminating the superheroic precision of protagonist Leon Kennedy isn't a great demonstration for a new device. It's an unfortunately hostile experience for those who aren't seasoned VR players, which is a shame because otherwise, Resident Evil 4 is a lovingly remade here. VR in general also wasn't the revolution I was expecting either. In regards to using the hardware, its heavy display fit uncomfortably on my face, and the tedium of Wiimote-like menu navigation got old fast. As for software, there was nothing I tried that was noticeably improved by either head or hand tracking. That said, there were a few activities I did have fun with. Beat Saber does for VR what Dance Central did for the Microsoft Kinect, be the only good reason to buy into the device. Some art programs were also pretty cute, though not exactly Photoshop replacements. Finally, there were those few games that you can easily play without VR that did get some bump thanks to hand controllers. The ghost hunting game Phasmophobia, and the people-curated metaverse VR Chat. VR Chat seemed to be the one game that sparked my imagination, as I did end up using its simple machinima for my last video of 2021. There I could puppeteer the protagonist of games my interviewees had chosen as their respective games of the year, giving the video some additional production value. The intent had actually been for a version of the RE4 video to do likewise, where I'd be Crash Bandicoot chilling in the initial village of RE4, as well as visiting some obviously metaverse locations like a private island when talking about those points. I'd even floated the concept to those I knew with VR headsets in case they wanted to be a video capture crew. Alas, it was not to be. As 2021 turned into 2022, the metaverse videos slowly progressed as I worked on it around more immediate ideas. The video had now taken shape as making RE4 scary, with a concept of how VR had put horror back into a game I was used to, and in turn, I was scared of an upcoming metaverse future. But the problem with slowly chipping away at an idea that you don't quite have a bead on is that sometimes people can beat you to the punch. On May 27, 2022, YouTube big deal and long-term thumbnail customer Jacob Geller had messaged me asking for a new one about RE4 VR, and it turned out that we had hit upon almost exactly the same video concept. It was a sign that perhaps I could feel alright just leaving the idea to pasture, especially because Jacob's video came out a few weeks later and was really good. I should stress that just because a video has been done before, you shouldn't avoid covering similar topics. Authorial voice is a huge differentiator between projects, and in fact that was part of my motivation for working on what this video eventually became. I could have still made that original video Jacob was also doing, and it would have turned out differently, but the reason I didn't is because I no longer had the desire to. But it was an interesting turn of events that my video idea had been done elsewhere. In some respects, this gave me permission to do something else. After almost a year of development, I had figured out that I didn't really care that much for RE4 VR, but there was a lot I had found captivating from researching the original game. In the initial version of the video, I needed to answer a question of why Facebook were adapting RE4, and while I could have just stopped at saying, well, it's popular and it's already been ported a dozen times previously, I wanted to answer those questions, and that had led me down interesting rabbit holes of developer interviews and replaying it across versions. Through anal eyes, I started to see in Resident Evil 4 the invisible tutorials that Capcom were employing, the push and pull of systems like pesetas, even the mental effects of mundane elements like on-screen widgets. Part of the fun of writing about games is pulling them apart to try and get a full appreciation for what they do best, and doing that with Resident Evil 4 had inspired the one to just rework the video's concept entirely to focus on just that one game. As if further motivation were needed, on June 4th of 2022, the remake of Resident Evil 4 was teased at Sony's State of Play event. This remake felt inevitable considering swirling rumours and the success of 2019's Resident Evil 2, but to have it confirmed was a pleasant surprise. However, only in-engine footage was shown without gameplay details, leaving discussion wide open for what Capcom could do. 4 days after that event, I decided to test out an idea on Twitter, writing a thread about the UI of the original RE4. It was a personal challenge of whether I could make something captivating in a thread of 280 character responses, using screenshots and illustrations where necessary. I did so to build up the story of how RE4 differed from the originals, how the UI adapted in the future, and thoughts on where the remake could go. The thread managed to grow beyond my usual audience and was positively received. I decided to use that thread as the basis for a video that came out 2 weeks later, missing Capcom's follow-on event that still didn't reveal any on-screen elements. As if to call my shot, I announced in that video that my still in progress larger video would be coming, quote, before the remake. In those following weeks, the burnout of recently moving homes and jobs had sapped the fun out of making videos, and so I decided to try other projects. The fun of writing about the shoot mechanics of RE4 eventually set me off for doing a podcast mini-series about forgotten FPS games called Bullet Time, and I did eventually do a few other videos later in the year as a break from that project. But as I found my footing again in 2023, this RE4 video re-emerged. I was on track to miss the release of the RE4 remake, but rather than completely rework my idea to compare the two games, I decided to just enjoy working on the script as it was now. The thing I had found endearing about the original Resident Evil 4 was its association with the Nintendo GameCube. Despite being ported to so many systems, there are versions of that game out there with the iconic only for GameCube triangle on the box art. As its creators had originally intended, the GameCube's hardware quirks and need to succeed impacted the final version of RE4, and arguably turned it into the action title every third-person shooter has riffed on since. This is why I wanted to make a retrospective in order to dig into this angle. I enjoy pulling at the roots of video games history and seeing where they lead, as well as talk about game design from a holistic approach. But more so, I've never made a video like this before, and I really wanted to. I wanted to do all the retrospective things, like have developer quotes and magazine cutouts to show RE4 outside of my own observations. The one time I had made a long video on my own was looking at multiple games that developed on the concept of Tetris, but this RE4 video would be focused almost entirely on one game. I say almost because I couldn't help myself talking about the games that were influences in RE4, and then were later influenced by it. I was also happy knowing that this wasn't really a hot cider video, whatever that means. I think I have figured that out since the last time I made one of these production story videos, but like this RE4 retrospective and this RE4 retrospective thing you're watching right now, I want to continue experimenting with new formats. It finally seemed as if after 2 years and quite the squiggly journey that the video had figured itself out. But the challenges didn't end once I had gone into full production. To test the video's viability, I decided to use my new podcast skills to make an audio-only version. In fact, if you'd rather enjoy it as background noise, there's a link to an MP3 in that video's description. To give this audio some additional production value, I put in background music, sound effects, and even employed the vocal talents of my video friends to read quotes. I added these flourishes not because of insecurity around my vocal performance, but rather I thought it would uplift the entire project. I tested it out on other content creators and they were warm on it, but there was no viable path for a larger audience. The problem is that there isn't really an audio version of YouTube, and by that I mean a platform with good discoverability without a video format. So if I wanted a new audience to listen to what I had done, ironically it would need video, which became a whole new issue. How do I make a 90-minute video on one game? I'm fortunate enough to have networked with creators big and small in my time on YouTube, either because I've made thumbnails for them or they think I'm a really lovely guy. From those folks, I've gotten a few tips and tricks on video production which might be useful for you. In the case of making a 90-minute video, I didn't have to do it all in a linear fashion. In fact, it was easier to tackle each chapter as its own separate video, meaning that the project wouldn't degrade in quality as it reached its climax. That said, I did treat the first few minutes of the video with the utmost importance, as that's where the majority of viewers are going to decide whether they want to stick or twist. I think it's partially why video essays are such a popular format, because you can use those first few minutes to lay out the central thesis you're going to be developing, essentially giving viewers a logline on what they can expect. Of course, you can also use those initial few minutes to wow a viewer. In my case, I tried to hammer in the points of all the ports Resident Evil 4 had received, by reading them all out with their associated console startup noise. Although I had already completed all of my audio before the video editing began, the final product required some extra flourishes. Something that I've been experimenting with in the past few videos has been using small mechanical flicks as a means to denote the beginning of a new topic or bullet point, punctuating a change in on-screen video. It's a similar technique that's used by Vox's motion graphics to keep a viewer's attention, and I think they serve to do similar in longer videos. It also adds some analog warmth to a project, as if this presentation had slides physically moving in and out. It's something familiar, but it also tricks us into thinking additional effort was applied. I do have to shout out the creator Chipmunku-chan There we go. I do have to shout out the creator Chipmunku-chan, who has used this to great effect in their own videos, and from whom I mostly cribbed the concept from. As for visuals, I did my best to try and keep a consistent look throughout, which too has been something that's developed across previous videos and experimented with here. I label any on-screen game when they appear for the first time, or, as was the case in this 90-minute video, when they became relevant to a point discussed long after they were introduced. I feature the title of the game, their developer, and year of release. When talking about older games or previous events, I like to use a strict aspect ratio and CRT border to unify all video materials. It was useful to do this when talking about games that came out before RE4, as it was one of the last few titles made in the pre-HD 16:9 era, but it also meant that when I was talking about RE4 via its PC port, that extra screen real estate contributed to the idea that it was a far more modern game, a subconscious trick to bolster my points. Any games covered in the wake of RE4 were all presented in HD and, when possible, 60 FPS. What to do about borders when displaying non-16:9 footage is a question nearly everybody has their own answer to, but I'd like to explain why I have my own approach. Simply, if I was covering a game or topic that didn't need 16:9, I wouldn't use it. When I cover Game Boy games like DK94 or Wario Land 3, I keep things square, and modern video codecs and YouTube happily support it. 2, if I want to limit information, for example, not show you all of this gross shit, then, keeping it square is pretty good. But in those instances where my main topic is 16:9 but I need supporting materials, I like using a static CRT frame. I find duplicated video or a colored image too distracting, and instead like the additional context of a TV frame. Accessibility is important, and while I can't guarantee that everyone will like my writing or presentation, I want to make sure that those who will won't be put off by feeling excluded. This is why almost every video I've made has closed captions for those who are hard of hearing or struggle to understand my accent. To further make my videos accessible, I've done my best to make sure that whenever static on-screen images are used, that I avoid too much complex motion, either behind or around these pieces. Earlier in the year, I applied some wiggly effects to on-screen text and images to give them some extra production value in a previous video, but in hindsight it made them harder to look at. That was a lesson learned that I have since applied forward. Obviously, these aren't always going to be valid options, and in fact, a lot of this will be down to personal taste. But these are elements that contribute to what a hot side of video is, and ultimately, this Resident Evil 4 video became an experiment in whether I could apply my usual techniques to something longer. I'm not the first person to make a retrospective on RE4, and I'm certainly not going to be the last, but it's incredibly unlikely that anyone is going to make a video exactly like mine. As said, authorial voice is an enormous differentiator, and that applies to every aspect of a video, from its initial conception all the way to creating a thumbnail and title. More so if you can get support from others, that will further contribute to making a unique product. At the time of this video's writing, the RE4 video has done okay. If I had released it before the remake of RE4, and especially if I had done so within its launch week, it likely would have done even better. But that's absolutely fine, because ultimately I made the RE4 retrospective video because I wanted to. Although this might sound like obvious advice, video making is such a pain in the ass that if you're going to do it, make sure it's because you have a love for it, and not out of a hope of being the next big thing. I've been fortunate that, as of the time of this upload, only 2 videos I've made have found enormous success because they were released at the height of a game's popularity. The most successful video I've made does well because it continues to be relevant, whilst the second most popular video was lucky enough to get picked up by the YouTube algorithm. I know that many would like to say that it's not an algorithm but the YouTube audience, but honestly I think my stuff would do better if people actually knew about it. That said, you shouldn't let fickle success stop you. The majority of content creators I work with are all enormously talented, despite being at vastly different levels of popularity. and often enormous success seems to be completely spontaneous. Many struggle with keeping that success going, and the ones who have been able to maintain it have done so thanks to the support of other creators. If, like me, YouTube is a hobby that comes secondary to full-time work, then at least appreciate that you can experiment. You're not at risk of alienating an audience or talent agent who needs you to keep replicating successes every month. Instead, be weird. Make stuff like a retrospective on RE4, because chances are you might find an audience who didn't know you existed previously through it. This is why video production is a squiggly line. There is no straightforward approach at any point of the process. Even if someone tells you that there is a direct path to success, ultimately your own personal makeup will challenge that. Having a thumbnail and title locked in at the beginning of the process is fine, but it shouldn't be a straitjacket on your creativity. This should hopefully answer the big question at the beginning of this story. Why did I make a video about Resident Evil 4 05 4 months after the remake came out? Well, it's because after 2 years of production, I figured out exactly what I wanted to make. Just a little bit too late for it to be relevant. But then, this isn't really the end of the story, and relevancy can change. YouTube is an ever-evolving audience, and fortunes can shift with their tastes. One day, this video on RE4 could be watched by someone who decides to share it to thousands of viewers. Or perhaps I could rework its title and thumbnail until I say the magic words. But neither of those things can happen if no video existed. 2, I do hope that watching this video hopefully teaches you something that can be applied to your own work, and removes a stopping point that you're struggling with. And to those of you who haven't before, I hope you may decide to take your own squiggly line journey.